Bath in November kept its secrets under fog. The grey came down off the hills each morning and sat in the streets until noon, and the fine houses on the crescent looked, for a few hours, like ships waiting for a tide that would not come. It was in this fog, on a morning in the second week of November, that Margaret Aldous walked to Renmore House with a letter sewn into the lining of her cloak, because she did not trust a pocket to keep it. She was 26, and she had stopped, some years before, expecting anyone to notice her walking anywhere. That was a mercy this morning. A woman noticed is a woman remembered, and Margaret did not wish to be remembered arriving at the Earl of Renmore's door on foot, her hem grey with damp, carrying a request no proud family likes to make. The request was this. Her brother Thomas, a curate with more faith than sense, had spent the parish's small restoration fund, money raised over 4 years, penny by penny, from a congregation that did not have pennies to spare, on the promise of a builder who took the money and was never seen in Somerset again. The fund had been meant to mend the roof of St. Euwane's, the old chapel that stood on Renmore land, the church the Aldous family had kept for 3 generations as its living. Now the roof let in the rain, the fund was gone, and the Earl, whose grandfather had built the chapel and whose family still, by ancient right, owned every stone of it, though they had not set foot inside in a decade, held the deed, and could, if he chose, deconsecrate the ruin and sell the land for its stone. Thomas could not go and confess it. He had taken to his bed with the shame of it, the way some men take to drink. So his sister had put on her plainest bonnet and gone instead, because in the Aldous family, as in most families that have run low on money and luck together, it was always Margaret who went. Renmore House rose out of the fog like something not quite finished deciding to exist. It was newer than the old townhouses around it, built in cold grey stone, its windows tall and dark and giving nothing away. Margaret stood across the street a moment and reminded herself of the only thing she had ever found useful in moments like this, that fear enlarges a door in the mind far past its true size, and that the door itself, once you are through it, is only a door. She crossed the street. She lifted the knocker, which was heavy and cold and shaped like a hawk with its wings folded, and she let it fall. The footman who answered was young and unhurried, and looked at her wet hem before her face, in the particular way of servants, trained to sort callers by the cost of their boots. "His lordship isn't receiving," he said, already closing the door to its final inch. "Then I will wait until he is," Margaret said. "I have come about St. Euwane's chapel, which I understand still bears his lordship's name upon the deed, and which is presently filling with rainwater. I imagine he would rather hear that news from a caller on his step than read it in a solicitor's letter next spring, when the roof has gone entirely and the cost has trebled." The footman hesitated. It was, Margaret had learned over many such doors, the hesitation that mattered. The half-second in which a servant decides whether the person in front of him is a nuisance to be turned away, or a problem that will be his fault if he turns it away wrongly. She had gotten very good at holding still through that half-second and letting it work in her favor. He let her into the hall to wait. The hall was black and white marble, cold enough that her breath showed. She did not sit. She had learned that sitting, in another man's house, before you have been asked, is a kind of apology you have not yet earned the right to make. A woman came down the stair some minutes later, not young, dressed in unrelieved grey, with the upright bearing of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated and has stopped minding it. This was, Margaret would learn, Mrs. Fenwick, who had been housekeeper at Renmore since the old Earl's time, and answered to no one but the family and her own considerable opinion of things. "You're the Aldous girl," Mrs. Fenwick said, looking her over without apology. "The curate's sister." "I am." "He's a good man, your brother, soft but good, and you've come to answer for his softness, I expect, since he hasn't the stomach to answer for it himself." There was no unkindness in it, only the flat accuracy of a woman who had seen a great many families manage their shames by sending the daughter. "Someone must," Margaret said. "It may as well be the one who isn't currently in bed with the guilt of it." Something that was nearly a smile crossed Mrs. Fenwick's face. "Come up then. He's in the North Gallery. He won't like being interrupted, and he won't like what you've come to say even less, but you've a straighter back than most who come begging, and I find I'd rather see what he makes of you than send you off in the wet." The North Gallery was long and lined with windows that let in the fog rather than the light. At the far end, a man stood before a portrait, not looking at it so much as standing guard over it. He was tall, dressed with a plainness that in a lesser man would have looked like economy, and in him looked like indifference to the whole apparatus of being looked at. He did not turn when they entered. "I said no callers, Mrs. Fenwick." "You said no callers you'd invited, my lord. This one invited herself, on a matter of your own roof falling in. I thought you'd rather know standing than by letter." He turned then. Margaret had built him, in the walk across town, into something colder than what stood before her. She had expected a face closed like a ledger, and found instead a face that was simply tired, in the specific way of a man carrying a weight he has stopped mentioning, because mentioning it changes nothing. His eyes were a pale, clear grey, the colour of the fog outside, and they came to her face and stayed there, which she had not expected either. "Miss Aldous," Margaret said, "my brother is curate at St. Ewain's. I have come to tell you, before you hear it from anyone with less reason to tell it plainly, that the restoration fund for the chapel roof has been lost. My brother was defrauded by a builder he trusted too far and vetted too little. The money is gone. The roof is failing. I am told there is rot now in the west rafters that will bring the whole down by another winter if nothing is done." She had rehearsed saying it without flinching, and she managed it, though it cost her something. The Earl, James Harcourt, 6th Earl of Renmore, though she did not yet know his given name, studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You have come to confess your brother's failure to me yourself. I have come to tell you the truth, my lord, because someone owed it to you plainly, and he could not bring himself to say it. I am not here to defend what he did. It cannot be defended. I am here to ask what you mean to do about a chapel that is, whatever its condition, still yours." "And what would you have me do?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said, and this admission seemed to surprise him more than anything she had said before it. "I came to tell you the truth, not to arrange the ending in advance. I find people trust the truth more when it isn't wearing a request already sewn to it." He almost smiled. She saw it start and stop, the way a door opens an inch and is thought better of. "Most people who come to me about that chapel," he said, "come to ask for money, or forgiveness, or both, and dress the asking up as something else. You have managed to do neither. That is either very honest or very clever." "I have found," Margaret said, "that I am not clever enough to be dishonest, and remember which lie I told to whom. Honesty is simpler. It requires no bookkeeping." This time the almost smile finished itself. It did not last long, but she saw it, and she understood she had been, in some small way, seen in return, not measured for her hem or her family's failure, but looked at as a person who had said something true and been heard saying it. "Come to the chapel with me," he said abruptly. "Tomorrow, if the weather allows it. I have not set foot in St. Ewain's in 10 years. I find I would like to see what my grandfather built and what your brother's fund was meant to save, before I decide what I owe either of them." St. Ewain's stood a mile beyond Renmore's park wall, on a rise above a stream that had, in wetter centuries, been diverted to feed the abbey that once stood there before the chapel replaced it. It was small as churches went, grey stone gone soft and green with lichen, a single squat tower, a graveyard tilted with age. Margaret had known it her whole life, had been christened at its font, had watched her mother's coffin carried through its door, and she felt, walking up the path beside a man she had met only the day before, an unexpected tenderness toward the whole absurd errand, that she should be showing a stranger the inside of her own grief. He stopped outside the door and looked up at the tower a long moment before he went in. Inside, the damage was plain, even in the grey light. Water had come through the west end of the roof for at least 2 winters. The plaster below had bloomed black with damp, and one of the old oak pews sat askew, where the flagstones beneath it had heaved with rot in the joists. The east window, a small, unfashionable thing of plain-coloured glass, nothing grand, but old, older than the rest of the building, was intact, and threw a thin, cold light across the ruin of the floor. "My grandfather built this with the last of his own money," the Earl said quietly, looking up at the rafters. "Not his father's money, not the estate's, his own, from a mine share that came good when he was a young man and had nothing else to show for himself. He used to say a church built on money, a man earned himself, stands longer than one built on money he inherited, because he minds it more. I used to think that was sentiment. I am beginning to think he simply understood something about what a man is willing to mend." "Why have you not come in 10 years?" Margaret asked, and then, hearing how bare the question sounded, added, "You needn't answer that. It isn't my place to ask it. My mother is buried in the yard," he said, after a silence long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. "She died the same winter my father did, a fever that took them both within a fortnight of each other, when I was 22 and entirely unready to be an earl. I stood in this chapel at both funerals within 10 days of one another, and when it was over, I found I could not come back through that door without the whole of it coming back with me. So I stopped coming. I told myself it was grief. I have begun to suspect, lately, that it was cowardice that had simply learned to dress itself as grief, because grief is forgiven and cowardice is not. Margaret looked at the black-bloomed plaster, the askew pew, the thin cold light through the old glass. She thought of her own mother's coffin carried through that same door, and how she had not, until this moment, considered that grief might close a door as easily on an earl as on a curate's daughter, that a title brought no exemption from the particular loneliness of a church you cannot bear to enter. "It is not dead," she said. "The building, I mean, wet and neglected, and in want of someone with the courage to walk through the door more than once a decade, but not dead. Stone does not die of grief. It only waits to see whether anyone is coming back for it." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face she would come, in time, to recognize as the particular expression of a man being told a true thing he had not expected to hear from a stranger on a cold morning. "You sound very certain of that," he said. "I have some experience of mending things that other people had given up on," Margaret said. "My family has had a great deal of practice at it. It is, I am sorry to say, nearly the only skill we have left." He did not answer at once what he meant to do about the chapel. He asked, instead, if she would walk the building with him and tell him plainly what needed mending and what could wait. And she did, moving through the nave with the unhesitating competence of someone who had spent years making do, pointing out the rafters that could be saved with proper drying and those that could not, the plaster that would need stripping to the stone, the window that, whatever else was done, must on no account be touched, because old glass like that could not be replaced for any money in England. He listened. He asked questions that showed he was actually listening, which she had not expected of an earl, and which unsettled her more than his rank had. At the door, as they left, he said, "Your brother is fortunate in his sister." "My brother is fortunate that I was raised to be useful rather than ornamental," Margaret said. "It has served the family better on the whole, though I don't imagine it was the intention." "I find," said the Earl of Renmore, "that I have very little use for ornamental people. They are pleasant to look at across a room and entirely unhelpful in a crisis, and my life has lately had rather more crisis in it than rooms worth looking pleasant in." He said it lightly, but she heard under the lightness something that was not light at all, the particular fatigue of a man who has been managed and flattered and courted for his title until he has stopped trusting anyone who is pleasant to him, because pleasantness, in his experience, is a tax people pay in advance of asking for something larger. She did not flatter him in return. She had nothing to gain by it, and she found, walking back toward Renmore House through the thinning fog, that she did not want to. He sent for the county's best builder within the week, not the roofing man who had swindled Thomas, but a careful, unhurried craftsman named Odom, who had restored 2 other old churches in the Shire and did not take a shilling until the stone told him what it needed. He paid for the whole of the work himself and told Margaret, when she came, as she now came often, drawn back by the excuse of overseeing the mending on her brother's behalf, that he would hear no talk of repayment. "It is my grandfather's chapel," he said. "The debt, if there is one, is mine to my own family's memory, not yours to me." "You are very determined not to be thanked," Margaret said, watching Odom's men strip the rotten plaster from the west wall in a fine grey dust that hung in the cold light like something almost holy. "I have been thanked a great many times in my life," the Earl said, "usually by people who wanted something further from me and thought thanks a cheap coin to pay for it. I find I would rather not be thanked at all than be thanked in that particular currency. You have never once thanked me, Miss Aldous." "I have noticed it. I find I prefer it enormously." "I have been too busy being useful to spare the time," Margaret said, and he laughed. A short, surprised sound, as though laughter were a door he had also, without quite meaning to, stopped opening, and was startled to find still worked. The weeks that followed had a shape to them she had not expected, and did not examine too closely, for fear of what she would find if she did. He came to the chapel most days that the work continued, standing in the cold nave with his hands behind his back, watching the mending the way, she thought. A man watches something he is afraid to hope for too openly. She came because Thomas could not face the sight of the ruin he had caused, and because, She admitted this to herself only late at night, lying awake in the small, cold room above the vicarage. She had begun to look forward to the particular quality of his silences, which were not empty but full, in the way a held breath is full. He asked her, one afternoon in December, about her mother, whose grave lay not 20 feet from where they stood. "She is the reason the roof was ever worth saving to me," Margaret said. "She used to say the chapel was the one place in the parish where the Earl and the cobbler's wife knelt on the same stone floor, and that a roof that let the rain fall equally on both of them was doing God's own work of leveling. I thought it was sentiment when I was a girl. I have come to think she simply understood something true about what a church is for." "That is very like something my grandfather might have said," James said, "if my grandfather had ever managed to say anything without also managing to make money from it in the same breath." "You are unkind to him." "I am accurate about him," James said. "I loved him. That is not the same as pretending he was a saint. He built this chapel with his own money, and never once, in 40 years, let anyone forget it had been his own money. My father built nothing and spent everything, and never once let anyone forget the name he'd been born to. I have spent a great deal of my life trying to work out which of them I am more likely to become, and finding, on the days when I am honest with myself, that I do not much like either answer." "You could," Margaret said carefully, "simply be neither. A man is not required to be his father or his grandfather. He is only required, I think, to be honest about which parts of himself he has chosen and which he has merely inherited without examining." He looked at her a long moment in the cold light through the old glass. "You say things to me," he said, "that no one else says to me. Do you know that? Everyone else in my life measures each word before they hand it to me, the way one hands a coin to a man one isn't certain will give proper change. You simply say the true thing and let me manage what I do with it." "I have found," Margaret said, "that I have never had the leisure to be careful with people. Careful costs time, and time was the one thing my family could never spare." "I do not want you to learn to be careful with me," James said, low. "I find I would rather have the truth badly delivered than a kindness well rehearsed. I did not know, until you walked into my hall in the rain 3 weeks ago, how tired I had grown of rehearsed kindness. It was Odam, in the end, who found the second trouble, not in the roof, but in the deed itself. Turning over old parish papers to confirm a boundary line for the churchyard wall, he came upon a codicil to the 6th Earl's grandfather's will, filed and half forgotten, which stated plainly that should St. Euwane's ever fall into such disrepair as to be formally deconsecrated, the land and stone would pass not to the Earl's heirs, but to a cousin's branch of the family, long estranged, who had contested the old Earl's will once already, and would, Odam said grimly, contest it again the moment they learned of the clause. "You did not know of this," Margaret said, when James told her. His face gone the particular stillness she had learned meant he was holding something back from showing on it. "I did not. My father never mentioned it. I suspect he did not know either, or did not wish to know, since knowing would have meant caring for a building he had no more interest in than I did, before you walked into my hall. If word reaches my cousin Reginald that the roof was ever in the state you found it, if he learns how close the chapel came to ruin before Odam's men touched a stone, he will have grounds to claim it was already, in law, beyond saving. He has wanted Renmore's outlying land for a decade. He will not scruple to take the chapel from me by a technicality, if the technicality is handed to him." "Then he must not be handed it," Margaret said. "The roof is being mended. The rot is being drawn. In a month it will bear no evidence at all of what it was in November. Let him come and see a chapel standing whole, and let him find no purchase for his claim anywhere in it." "You speak as though it were simple." "It is not simple. It is only clear," Margaret said. "I have found those are not the same thing, whatever people say." Reginald Harcourt came in January, on a day of hard frost, with a solicitor at his elbow, and a letter alleging that St. Euwane's had stood, by his information, derelict and unconsecrated, in all but name for above a year, and that the estate was therefore forfeit under the old codicil. He was a soft, well-fed man with his cousin's colouring, and none of his cousin's stillness, and he walked into the mended nave, the new-laid roof golden with fresh timber, the plaster clean, the old east window washed and glowing, with the particular disappointment of a man who has arrived to collect a debt and found it already paid. "You have been busy, cousin," he said, looking about him with poorly hidden irritation. "I have," James said. "You will find, if your solicitor cares to examine the parish register, that services have been held here without interruption, every Sunday this 12-month, roof or no roof, by a curate who would sooner have preached under an open sky than let the living lapse. You will find no forfeiture here, Reginald. Only a chapel that was in want of mending, and has been mended. A curate too poor to mend his own roof is hardly proof the living was properly maintained. The living, said a voice from the chapel door, was maintained exactly as the law requires, sir, and I have the parish register to show it, along with the testimony of every family in this valley who has been christened, married, or buried under this roof without a single Sunday's interruption, wet timber or no. Margaret had come in from the churchyard, her hands still cold from helping Odom's men set the new headstone curb, and she crossed the nave to stand beside James without asking herself, until afterward, whether she had any right to stand there at all. I would be glad to fetch the register now, if your solicitor would care to examine it, or would he rather take my word, since I am the one who has kept the accounts of every service held in this building for the past 4 years, in my brother's stead, and can account for each one. Reginald looked at her, measured her, in the old familiar way, the plain gown and the cold reddened hands, and made, visibly, the calculation that she was beneath his notice, which was, Margaret thought, the single most useful mistake he could have made, since it meant he did not trouble to doubt her. The register, when fetched, showed exactly what she had said. Reginald's solicitor examined it with the particular thoroughness of a man being paid to find fault, and finding none, and left, in the end, with nothing but the frost on his boots, and a cousin's cold civility ringing after him down the churchyard path. When they had gone, James stood a long moment looking at the register still open in Margaret's hands. You kept every service recorded, he said, for 4 years, before you had any notion this chapel would ever matter to a claim like Reginald's. I kept it because it was owed, Margaret said. The register is the truth of what a parish is, written down so no one may later pretend it away. I did not keep it for you, my lord. I kept it because a thing worth doing is worth doing properly, whether or not anyone is watching to see it done. That, James said, is precisely why it mattered so much when I needed it. He closed the register gently and set it on the sill beneath the old east window, where the thin January light fell across its worn cover. Margaret. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land somewhere under her ribs, quiet and entire. I have known you 3 months. I have watched you mend a roof, defend a register, and stand between me and a cousin who would have taken this whole chapel out of spite. And in all that time you have asked me for nothing, not money, not favor, not even thanks. I find I no longer know how to imagine this church, or this life, without you standing somewhere in the middle of it, telling me the truth whether or not I have asked to hear it. I do not know the proper way to say this. I am not certain there is a proper way. I have simply found that I love you, and that I would rather say it badly, standing in a half-mended chapel with frost on the flagstones, than wait for some better moment that may never trouble itself to arrive. Margaret stood very still in the cold, bright nave, beside the register that held 4 years of her own quiet keeping, and found that the fear which had walked her to Wrenmore House in the fog 3 months before had gone somewhere she could no longer locate it. I came here to confess my brother's failure, she said, and stayed to mend a roof, and find I have gone and mended rather more than that, without ever quite meaning to. I do not know the proper way to say it either. So I will simply say, I love you as well, and I would rather say it here, on the stone my own mother is buried beside, than anywhere grander that would only make it feel less true. He took her hand, cold, ink-stained from the register, and held it in both of his, exactly as a man holds a thing he has decided, at last, he will not again let go untended. They were married at St. Ewain's in the spring, when the new roof had weathered its first proper rain, and held, and the old east window threw its thin coloured light across a nave full of exactly the mixture her mother had always spoken of, the Earl's tenants, and the cobbler's family, kneeling on the same mended stone. Thomas, restored at last from his long shame by a curacy his sister had quietly, patiently helped him rebuild, read the service with a steadiness he had not owned in a year. Mrs. Fenwick wept without apology from the second pew, and told anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first half-second at the door, that the girl with the wet hem and the straight back was worth letting in out of the rain. Reginald did not come. He sent, some months later, a stiff note of grudging civility, which James read once, laughed at once, and never mentioned again. The chapel did not become grand. It was never meant to be. But it stood, roof sound and register kept, through every winter that followed, And on the anniversary of that first grey morning, the Countess of Renmore could be found, without fail, walking the mile from the great house to the small one, in whatever weather the day saw fit to offer, because she had learned, long before she ever climbed the steps of Renmore House with a letter sewn into her cloak, that the buildings worth keeping are never the ones that never fall into disrepair. They are only the ones that someone, in the end, is willing to come back for.